Success Series. I'm your host, Gino Rofero, and we are very excited today to have Mike Levy with us. Mike Levy is a very distinguished entrepreneur. Mike founded and is the former CEO of SportsLine.com, a leading sports media company. They've published sites such as NFL.com, MLB.com, the PGA Tour.com, NCAA.com, as well as Sports.com. SportsLine was listed on NASDAQ and was eventually acquired by CBS, and is what today is CBS Sports.com. At SportsLine, Mike has done many deals with superstar athletes including Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, Shaquille O'Neal, Joe Namath, John Elway, and many more. Mike took SportsLine public in 1997, raising $32 million initially, and shortly thereafter another $300 million. During the internet boom years of SportsLine, their market cap routinely exceeded $1 billion. Mr. Levy was featured in Forbes' cover story with other internet entrepreneurs such as Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon.com, and Jerry Yang, the founder of Yahoo.com. Mike is routinely interviewed and is featured in Forbes and Fortune magazine. He's a frequent guest on CNBC, Bloomberg, and CNN. Mike, we're very excited to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Gino.
Mike, you've certainly accomplished a lot in your life. We have a lot of entrepreneurs that watch this show, and we would like to kind of go back in time from your early years and just learn a little bit about how you started, maybe what was your first job, and how did you start your career in business?
Okay, Gino, I grew up in Miami, and when I was always good in math and science courses, I never really worked that hard at it and made good grades, and I felt like with that type of, and I never really cared for liberal arts too much, English and
Sure.
things like that. So I had a concentration on engineering. I decided early on that I wanted to be an electrical engineer. And when I graduated from Miami High in 1964, I started looking around at what schools I'd like to go to, and I ended up deciding on Georgia Tech because they had a great curriculum, and they also had a co-op program that would allow me to work every other quarter so I could pay my tuition. Otherwise I couldn't have afforded it. So my first real work experience was working at Florida Power and Light as a junior engineer in the off quarters. So I paid my whole way through school by doing that. The one thing I really learned, about the work environment is that I never wanted to work for a power company when I graduated. So I graduated in electrical engineering. About the time I graduated in 1969, there was a very hot job market for double-E majors. And I was being flown all over the country for interviews to Eastman Kodak, to Texas Instruments, all over the place. And I ultimately decided on a job where I could get into design engineering right away. And that was at a company called Harris Corporation in Melbourne, Florida. It was their radiation division. And I was in the aerospace group working on missile control systems. And that was my first real engineering job. But about a year into it, the space program started cutting back and defense started cutting back, and there were layoffs all over the place. I can still remember on Friday afternoons when the loudspeaker would come on in the building, that's when they would page people to the boss's office and we're going to get laid off. And so I somehow survived that for most of the first wave of layoffs. And at the one day, though, they finally called my name. And when I went in to see the boss, I figured, okay, this is it. He said, look, we're not laying you off. We're transferring you to another division. So I went to work in the controls division, and there I really learned a lot about design work. I developed supervisory control systems for electric utilities and for oil pipelines. And that was a pretty interesting work. It led me into developing products with microprocessors in 1972 when the very first single chip microprocessors came out by Intel. So that was a pretty good benefit of that. And another company in Miami called Milgo Electronics was just starting to get into intelligent computer terminal products, and they heard from Intel that I was the only guy in the state that was designing anything with microprocessors. So they brought me on as a senior engineer. I moved up to an engineering management position, and this is all within 5 or 6 years of graduating from Georgia Tech. After that, I was approached by a guy who he was a Greek immigrant. He had an idea of developing a handheld electronic language translator, and this is back in 1976, and it was really at a time when the technology wasn't around to be able to do that. You didn't have the right displays or processors or memories to really make that work. But I felt like we could do something, and I stayed in touch with this guy for the next few years. We finally started a company, he and I together, and this is my first real entrepreneurial experience. We started this company, just the two of us, and we visited New York and met with a bunch of these small underwriters. And we found one that would do a $500,000 public offering for us. And I was still working at Milgo Electronics when that happened. We raised $500,000. We developed a prototype of the language translator. And our stock in 1 year went from 1 to 18.
Wow.
And we sold the translator to Neiman Marcus, Bloomingdale's, Macy's. It was pretty interesting, but it was an up and down ride because it was more of a fad product than anything else.
Sure.
But I was at Lexicon for 15 years. And we developed all kinds of things. We went from the language translator, which we sold to a German company, to some of the earliest credit card authorization terminals, and eventually into some defense electronics. So it was a very interesting experience, and I sold out of that company in 1993 and retired for the first time. And later that year, late 93, early 94, I had the idea for SportsLine.
Did you always know that you wanted to be in the engineering field from a young age?
Pretty much, I'd say from about the 9th or 10th grade. And
Okay.
again, that was primarily based on being good at math.
Let's talk about SportsLine. How exactly did that come about? What gave you the idea for SportsLine, and how did you start it?
Well, I was looking for something to do, and I looked at a couple of other opportunities, but I was a heavy user of online services back then. I was a member of both Prodigy and CompuServe. And I used to check stock quotes and information. There was no internet at that point, at least no commercial internet. Mm-hmm. So these were straight dial-up services. And America Online had just gone public that year in 1993, and they were getting a lot of publicity. Their stock price had gone way up. And I felt towards late 93 that eventually everyone would be online. Now, I'd never even heard of the internet at that point. But I felt like everybody would be on America Online or Prodigy or CompuServe. And they were broad-based services, and I felt like, and I like sports, and I started to think about maybe do a vertical service in sports. Because I could never hope to compete with these guys across the board, but maybe in a vertical that they weren't attacking too heavily, I might have a chance. Mm-hmm. So I started to research what they were doing, and during the bowl games in around January 1st of 1994, I checked all three sites out, and none of them were doing a very good job at covering the bowl games. So I said, this looks like a wide open opportunity, and I thought sports gambling information could be big. So I had the idea at that point to develop a dial-up online service for sports. I had no clue how to do it, but I felt like there would be a great market if I could get it done. So I needed to find the right people to help me get it done, and we did over the next year. And prior to really raising a lot of money and spending a lot of money, the internet kind of made a breakthrough at the end of 1994. That's when Netscape started to download free browsers. That's when Netcom went public, and they were the first internet service provider, national internet service provider. Everything was really slow. You could not imagine at that time that we could do all the things on the internet that we're doing now. But it was a real breakthrough, and I decided right at the early part of 1995, January 95, to base the service on the internet.
To get the company going, did you use your own money to start it up, or did you also use investors right from the beginning, though?
Well, I started out, I knew I needed a business plan and I needed a prototype to start raising money. Mm-hmm. So I put in the initial money. I put in $200,000 of my own money. And I was able to find a guy who was a really top-notch writer and researcher. And he helped me with writing the business plan and doing the research that we needed. And I found another guy who was able to develop a prototype that was a suitcase-sized computer that I had to carry around to show people what it would look like. And we plagiarized videos from different DVDs we found and other things like that to put together a prototype that looked pretty good, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I took that thing around, lugged it all over the place. I was trying to raise $100,000 each from 20 investors. And this is in 1994. Mm-hmm. So I struck out just about everywhere I went. And I decided that I really needed to get a heavyweight type of guy that would give me a little bit of an ability to reach more people.
Sure.
And that's when I decided on Joe Namath. So this is a guy who's a Hall of Fame football player. Everybody knows him. He still gets a lot of publicity. If I could get Joe Namath to come in as a partner, I think I could, really boost the image of what I was trying to do. So I called Joe's agent, and he was very skeptical, but he agreed to meet with me. And then I met with Joe, and Joe said, "Yeah, sounds good, but you need to raise $2 million before I really put my name on this." And he would get a piece. He wouldn't get paid, but he'd get a piece of the company. And so that worked out pretty good. His agent was a tireless guy. And I went all over the place with his agent to meet with people who could potentially invest. And we had one day of meetings in New York. I had 9 meetings that day, one every hour for like 9 straight hours. And then we went to dinner with this guy. And the guy we went to dinner with knew nothing about sports. He's kind of a flamboyant guy. His company was in the plastics business, and he made garden hoses and Christmas trees, plastic Christmas trees for Walmart. And we went to dinner, and the next day, Joe's agent called me and said, the guy's name was Burke. Joe's agent called me and said, Burke is interested in investing, but he wants to do the whole $2 million.
Nice.
And we ended up doing it. Over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I got to know Burke, and I went up for the meetings with his lawyers to try to close the deal. And we're all sitting around this room. He's got his lawyers, his accountants. I've got my lawyer with me. And he tells his lawyers as the meeting starts, he said, "I don't want you to do any due diligence on this company because you'll talk me out of doing it. And I want to do it. So just make sure that if this guy dies, I get my $2 million back."
Sure.
So the whole negotiation was over the life insurance policy.
Nice.
And this guy had never bought stocks before. So he had $50 million in CDs. And this was his first stock investment, which he made a lot of money on. I was happy to see that.
So obviously he must have really trusted you and just bought into the whole concept.
Yeah, and that was about August, I'd say, of '94. And then I was able to start recruiting. And I hired a professional recruiter to help me find the technology guy who could lead the effort to build this, because back in those days, in the very early days of the internet, there were no packages, there was no hosting deals, there was none of this. Right. I mean, anything you wanted to develop, you had to do it yourself.
Sure.
So I needed to find the right kind of person, and I did. I got a guy from Apple Computer named Tom Eastwood, and he had been, prior to Apple, he had been with General Electric Information Services, and they had built these major online services for brokerages and banks that had to be bulletproof. And he recruited a team of guys from GE, and we had a great engineering team, and that really is one of the factors that made us successful, is that we got that service up and running, and it worked perfectly. It never went down in the first 5 years. And it was really one of the best moves I ever made at the start of SportsLine.
So building a solid team around you was
a solid technology team to begin with. And you're not going to get a great team necessarily when you start a company, because when you're trying to hire some of the people that I hired later, like I hired the president of Turner Sports Sales to come to work for me. Well, in those days, he never would have done it. It wasn't until after we raised serious venture capital and it looked like the internet was going to go places that I could get a guy like that. But on day one, it would have been impossible. So after I had my chief technology officer on board, we went out together to meet. We cold called Jim Barksdale at Netscape, who had just taken over as CEO. This was January of 1995. And Jim liked the concept, He said, you know, ESPN is doing the same thing you're trying to do with a company called Starwave in Seattle. Now, Starwave is backed by Paul Allen. They have ESPN as a partner, and they have all of these Sun Microsystem engineers working for them. So they don't really need our help. But there could be two players in the sports field, so we'd like to team with you, and we'll do your back-end software for you. So I said, that sounds great. So he said, by the way, do you need to raise capital? And, you know, of course you had to raise capital. I was faced with having to raise a lot of money to compete with ESPN. So he introduced me to Kleiner Perkins, who were the venture backers of Netscape. And Kleiner Perkins was very interested in the deal. They put up $3 million to start with, which ultimately led to us raising $40 million in venture capital over the next couple of years.
And that was before you went public?
Before we went public, yeah. We had a number of major venture backers, including Kleiner Perkins, New York Life, Reuters, TCI. We had a pretty good group of backers. And each one of those backers contributed a director. So some of my directors were very strong too, including Mickey Schulhoff, who's the former CEO of Sony, Joe Lacob, who owns the Golden State Warriors today. So some very strong guys. It really helped a lot.
So fast forwarding a little bit, you then eventually took the company public, obviously raised millions of dollars, and tell us about how that affected your company and what SportsLine was able to do shortly after that.
Well, to actually take the company public, because when we were looking at doing this in 1996 and early 97, there weren't too many internet companies going public yet. A few of them had, like Netscape and so on, but we were in a tough position because we were, even though we had a good service, we were up against ESPN, and they were able to promote their service on television. We were doing everything we could to get PR coverage, and one of the biggest things we did was sign up Shaquille O'Neal, who got us our first national press coverage. But we needed to get a television partner, and that was critical for us. And in 1996, actually, in the day before Thanksgiving, our head of sales and I went up to New York, and we met with NBC and we met with CBS. And where we got a lucky break is that CBS had just announced a new president for sports, Sean McManus. And I had met Sean when he was at IMG. They were our marketing partner. So Sean was open to the idea, even though he didn't even know how to use a computer himself. He was open to the idea of doing this, and he had a guy working for him who was really gung-ho about it. So over the next 5 months, we negotiated a deal with CBS where they would become a minority partner in the company, and they would promote SportsLine on all of their sports programming, and the service would be renamed CBS SportsLine. And that singular event was probably the most important thing in our history, because that gave us the credibility to take the company public in late '97. It also gave us the credibility in 1997 to sign up Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan, which were the two biggest names in sports.
Tell us about some of those deals. How did you end up doing a deal with Michael Jordan?
It wasn't easy because his agents are really tough guys. They're hard to deal with, and they drive a very hard bargain. And Michael Jordan's sponsors included Nike and Sara Lee and all of these major corporations.
Right.
So every one of them were paying him millions of dollars. So I had to start out by saying we can't pay any cash, we can only do stock. So my big sales job, and it was the same with Shaquille O'Neal and Tiger Woods, my big sales pitch to these agents was that the internet was going to be big. We were going to take the company public. They'd get stock options that would be worth way more than what we could pay them in cash. And they ended up going for that, and it turned out to be great for them too.
They ended up making some money.
Yeah.
So do you feel like having some of these superstar athletes was almost a key factor in
It was a
sports
key
line?
factor in the early days because we needed to get as much publicity as we could.
Sure.
And we were really lacking in national publicity until we signed Shaquille O'Neal in '96. That was the first time that we really were on national television. We had a big press conference in New York where Shaq was there, I was there, and we did the introduction. And he had a website, a crude website that was built by Microsoft. So he was leaving Microsoft to come with us. And he was also in the process of deciding where he was going to go because he was a free agent. He was playing for Orlando at that point, and there was a lot of speculation that he might go to the Knicks or he might go to the Lakers. So when it was announced that he would be present at this press conference, the whole room filled up. I mean, we had television cameras all over the place. We had all of the print media was there. We were on all of the ABC affiliates nationwide. We were on CNN, and that was really a breakthrough for us.
So what were some more of the highlights of SportsLine in your career?
I think some of the big steps after we did the deal with CBS was really to start generating revenue in a significant way. And to do that, we needed a very strong sales force. And unlike a lot of internet companies, like a Yahoo, for example, that relied on people doing a search and finding a keyword they were interested in and clicking on it to take them someplace, we weren't like that. We were a destination site. Nobody was coming to SportsLine to go look for something else. They were there to find out what was going on in sports, news, information, fantasy leagues. So I kind of felt that for us to be successful in advertising, we needed not an internet strategy, we needed more of a television strategy. Because on television, when you watch a sports program, you're not going to link to somewhere else. You're getting that brand advertising, whether it's beer, whether it's cars or fast food or technology or whatever it is. So we felt that we needed a sales staff that was oriented towards selling advertising to people who sponsored sports on TV. And that's where I had the idea to bring in a guy from that industry. And I found a guy who was president of sports sales for Turner and brought him in. And he was used to fighting the big guys like CBS and ABC and all of them. So when he came in, that made all the difference in the world. And he built a very strong sales team. And the way we were able to sell advertising successfully is that we would figure out who had the game on TV. Let's say it was U.S. Open tennis, and Cadillac was a sponsor, and IBM was a sponsor. Well, we would say, okay, let's go to those guys. Let's go to IBM. Let's go to Cadillac, and say, look, you can extend your brand. You know, you're going to be on the television broadcast anyway, but now you can extend your brand to the internet where it's 24/7. And you'll reach the same demographic, the higher end of that demographic, and that was a very successful sales approach.
So what were some of the major challenges you faced, and how did you overcome those challenges, and kind of what are some big lessons that you learned that you can kind of share with others?
Well, I think anybody would tell you, any successful entrepreneur would tell you, never take no for an answer. And you had to keep working some of these deals, and there were deals that looked like they would never happen, but if with time and perseverance, we made most of them come through at the end. The best example of that was the NFL. When I first started and we launched our product, the NFL had already committed to have their own site built by ESPN. So NFL.com was produced by our main rival. And when we started the season in 1995, we were going to put up all of the play-by-play for every NFL game on our site. So we did that, and the NFL sued us. They said that on the Monday after the first Sunday games in 1995, we got sued by the NFL. And so I had to spend a lot of time working things out with them, coming up with a license agreement, all this kind of stuff. And every time that the site would come up again for renewal on NFL.com, they would continue to renew with the ESPN. And finally, they changed the management in that group. And in 2001, we put together the biggest internet deal that had ever been done up to that point. And we secured the rights to NFL.com along with America Online and with CBS. It was a 4-group deal. And every group had a contract with every other one. And this thing was a monster to negotiate. AOL put up $120 million. We built the site, sold the advertising, and split the revenues with all the parties, and CBS promoted it on TV. So it was a really great deal.
Wow, that's pretty awesome.
But it was a deal that took 5 or 6 years to actually put together. NFL.com was a huge deal for us, for sure. But there were a lot of other cases where initially we were turned down. In the IPO process, I tried to do an IPO probably a year earlier, and we just weren't ready for it. And I met with a lot of investment bankers, and it looked like we were going to go down that road. Then we pulled back, but ultimately we were able to be successful. We found a group of underwriters that were led by Roberts and Stevens. And in November of 1997, we went public. We raised $32 million at $8 a share. And we were trying to sell the stock at $10. But there was a letdown in NASDAQ right as we closed. And I don't know if you know how these public offerings work, but you have to do a roadshow where you go out and you talk to institutional investors. And this roadshow was pretty grueling. We started in Copenhagen, and we went to Stockholm and then London. The next week we were in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Texas. We went 3 different cities in Texas. And then the third week we ended up hitting California. And when we and finally wound up the whole roadshow in Denver. And it was snowing in Denver, and we had to do the final pricing on the deal with the bankers. You know, they would tell us. So we're on a conference call. We're in the limousine, and we're at the at Denver Airport, and my chief financial officer and I are on cell phones, and there are about 30 other people on the call, including representatives from the 3 different investment bankers, our lawyers, their lawyers, the auditing firms. You know, it was just tons of people. And at the end of the day, it came down to Fidelity, who was the biggest investor in it, and they would agree only to pay $8, and we were pushing for a higher number. And I said, look, my motto in business, and this is a good thing for entrepreneurs to know, is to take the money, which we did. You know, I think too many times people turn down offers at certain valuations, and then later they wish they would have taken them. So even though we were disappointed in the price, we took the offer. We raised $30 million. And then right after the first of the year, internet stocks started taking off, and our stock by the end of January was at $20. And it started to still creep up during the month of February. And the guys at Roberts and Stevens called me back and said, look, do you want to raise more money because the stock is going up? So let's file and do a secondary offering. So when we filed for a secondary offering in March, our stock was at about 26. And we got on the roadshow again. And this time we're pros at it. You know, we've been through it already. And we finished the roadshow this time in San Diego. And the stock had just closed that day at 37 5/8. So we did the secondary deal at a number more than 4 times what we did on the IPO 4 months earlier.
That's awesome.
Raised $150 million. Our investors, some of the guys that worked in the company, all that, we were able to take half of that. The other half went into the company. So that was the first time that any of us ever really cashed out, you know, and that was in 1998, about April.
So how many years of work went into that until you had that huge success, would you say?
Well, it was 4 years.
4 years.
But, you know, it was a lot of things had to happen the right way, and some things didn't happen as well as we wanted them to. But again, we were up against some very, very tough competition in ESPN. It was good and bad. I think the hard part of it was being up against a giant like that was always a big challenge, and it was always a challenge to our credibility as to how could we ever compete with them. But on the other hand, because we were in it along with ESPN, it kind of discouraged other people from getting into it. And it was hard for anyone else to raise money to compete with us. So from that standpoint, it was good.
And then so eventually you ended up being acquired, SportsLine ended up being acquired by CBS.
Right.
And which is now today CBSSports.com.
Yes, and that's
pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's something I think I'm probably more proud of than anything, is that we created a company that's going to be around forever.
Right.
And it was in Fort Lauderdale. We had about, 400 employees or so. And I think there's about 250 still there. You know, so they're still running that operation out of Fort Lauderdale. They've consolidated sales up in New York and consolidated some other things, but all of the actual site creation work is done in Fort Lauderdale still. And a lot of guys that I hired in 1995 are still there.
Wow. Must be pretty exciting to, kind of go back and see that, and will be there forever.
Look, it's exciting to see
exciting.
what some of the guys that work there went on to do after SportsLine. One guy that ran our New York sales office, Tom Eriks, ended up being the head of sales for Facebook. Made a ton of money. He was one of the earliest employees at Facebook, and he retired only recently. Another guy, Ross Levinson, was the head of all of Fox's digital media. He went on to become the interim CEO of Yahoo, and he was just replaced by Marissa Mayer last year. So now he's the CEO of Guggenheim Partners, which owns the Dodgers and a couple of other big entities. So we've had some people go on to pretty successful careers after SportsLine.
What inspired you to be successful, and what still drives you today?
Well, I think a desire to make a lot of money was one of the things. I know most entrepreneurs never want to say that, but I think that I wanted to do interesting things. And my old company, Lexicon, allowed me to do that to some extent because I had taken Lexicon public from day one, but we never did it the right way. We didn't do it with venture capital. We raised money in the public markets, but we didn't really raise enough money. And it's hard when you're a real small public company to generate much enthusiasm or publicity. So, but I knew how to run a public company, and I knew that the next time around that I did it, I was going to do it where it could be a real public offering with real underwriters. And I think that was a pretty strong lesson I learned. And I also wanted to have a strong venture capitalist in the deal, because when you're trying to really become a large company and gain credibility, that's the first step, is to have a well-known venture capitalist behind you that gives you all the credibility.
Sure. For students or younger people that are kind of just starting off their entrepreneurial career, what is some advice you have for them to be successful?
It depends at what stage. Okay, if they're really smart high school students, I would tell them to go to Stanford or to Cal Berkeley, which are right in the heart of all of the entrepreneurial activity in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, because you have to face the fact that that's really where the action is these days. That's where venture capital is, that's where the smartest kids are, and where there's been more success than anywhere else. So, and if let's say they've already graduated from college and they're technology oriented, I tell them to go move out to Silicon Valley. I've known a couple of young people I've given that advice to, and they've done it, because there are a tremendous amount of opportunities there. It's very difficult in South Florida, for example, to get the credibility you need to get a serious Silicon Valley venture capitalist involved in your deals.
What would you say in general are maybe the three most important keys to success for you that help make your career successful?
I think that you have to have a lot of drive, okay, and you've got to be relentless. And the people you hire have to have a lot of drive and be relentless too. So you're not going to do this with wallflowers. So you need to build a team that's really an aggressive team that are all fighting for the same thing. And you do that a step at a time. As I said before, you're not going to get some of the real superstars on day one, but you want to get people who can get you to the next level where you can get to that point. So the people are very important, but of course the first thing, you've got to have the right concept for a product. You've got to be willing to be flexible and change it when you see that things aren't working the way you thought they were, because I don't think I've ever worked on anything that ever ended up being what I thought it would be when I started it. So you've got to be willing to change. You've got to come up with the right concept that can be developed, that can work. Because if you don't have that, you don't have anything. And then you need the right people to be able to develop it, because no one entrepreneur is going to know everything he has to know to do it. I didn't know anything about selling advertising on TV. I didn't know how to build a website. I didn't know, how to develop all of this content and all the other things. But I certainly found people that did know how to and could get along together and work towards the same goals. And then, of course, the most important part is raising enough money to make sure you can do it, because it's really tough to do things on a shoestring sometimes. And you've got to have backers that not only are willing to put up the money you need for the stage you're at, but who have deep enough pockets to come in on the next stage when you need them and give you the credibility to bring in other investors.
So why don't you just tell us a little about what you're up to today?
I pretty much retired, back when SportsLine got sold, but I've dabbled in a lot of other things, and I'm on all of these social sites like LinkedIn and Facebook and all these things. So just through LinkedIn alone, and I'm on Angel List too, which is another deal for raising money. So almost anybody that wants to do something involving sports technology gets a hold of me one time or another. I must get 2 or 3 inquiries a week.
And so right now,
Most of which are not that interesting, but I am working on a couple of things, not to hit a home run like SportsLine, but just something where I might be able to use my contacts and abilities to help a company grow in that area.
so today that company is called MaxPoint.
MaxPoint is a company that I do the business through, and one of my first clients was a company called MGT Capital, and they have a division called Fan Throwdown that's involved in sports and gambling on fantasy sports. So I helped get them off the ground, and they're rolling along very nicely right now. And I'm working now with a company called ViewMix that is involved in high-tech video, where they can take 9 active video streams and put them on a single iPad screen. And that technology is very interesting. It's patented, it's being investigated and actually tested by Comcast right now for a major rollout. But what I've done I saw the sports applications immediately in this. This is why they contacted me in the first place. But I've got them in the NFL and at Major League Baseball and the NBA and in the PGA Tour, where their product is being evaluated. I've also taken it up to the Patriots and to the Golden State Warriors. Now, I'm not the guy I can talk about the applications and I can get them in the door, but it's up to their product as to whether it's going to be successful or not.
Yeah, I think it's awesome that you're still so active, even though you're retired. This is your second retirement, really.
Yeah, I'm kind of gratified that I can still get in and talk to these guys because in the case of the Patriots, Robert Kraft, who owns the Patriots, and his son Jonathan, who runs a team, I met them back in the late '90s, and they were instrumental actually in helping SportsLine get NFL.com. Now, I hadn't spoken to Jonathan Kraft in 10 or 12 years. So I sent him an email. He was happy to hear from me, and I got a meeting within the next week. So those kind of things are nice to see.
So obviously a lot of still exciting ventures to come from Mike Levy. Thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Gino, it's great to talk to you, and hopefully this will help a few aspiring entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.